Joe, what really makes something count as a negotiation in our terms?
It's two or more people wanting to get a mutual agreement. Mm-hmm. So if you are wanting to purchase something, whether it's small or big, personal or from business, and you are fully wanting to buy that thing and have buy the product at the price it is with all of the terms, you're not really negotiating because you're happy. Everybody's is happy with the item, so you just buy. If you go and think, well, I want to pay £1,000 for a car and the dealership wants me to pay £20,000 for the car, there's probably a really big price difference that you're never going to really come to some kind of agreement. Mm-hmm. So effective negotiation is where you're really wanting to have that overlap. Mm-hmm. So both parties have to make movements. You both have to make incremental steps towards that mutual agreement. Mm-hmm. And you're doing it where you can vary the terms so that you have flexibility in what you can talk about and what you can potentially trade. So I will give you this if you can do that. So that it's a two-sided agreement. And finally, you really negotiate when there's a bit more of a scarce resource. So if something isn't it's not available by every person and you can't find it everywhere, then the chances are it means a lot and you really want to come to some kind of common ground. So kind of thinking about, is this something that is too far away or close together, but you're really looking to get that overlap.
Excellent. So we used in the intro, Tony, the example of a pay rise. So if someone was to come to you asking for one, is that a negotiation most of the time when you see it coming along?
Well, if you take the criteria that Joe gave, then it technically probably isn't. You know, in some cases, it's somebody asking for something. It isn't necessarily mutually beneficial unless, and there may be something tacit in this, where people start to say, "Oh, you understand that if I don't get this pay rise, then I'm going to leave." Mm. Now, whether or not that's said or not, you've then got something that's tradable and negotiable. If, as long as, of course, you don't want them to leave. If you do want them to leave, then the answer is no, you're not going to pay rise. But as long as those things are in there, but quite often when people come and ask for pay rises, they are making a demand for something that they want paying more for what they've previously done, as opposed to saying, well, if I do this more or if I take on this responsibility, can I have a pay rise? So it can be a negotiation, but it isn't automatically a negotiation. I think that's where some people go wrong, and it's not necessarily even a persuasion, because usually it's, can I have a pay rise?
So there has to be something in it for both sides, that both people
for it to be a negotiation. Yes, okay. Yes, not necessarily. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody looking for a pay rise is in a pay negotiation, which is why I think sometimes if you read about these things in magazines, then you assume it's a pay negotiation, and quite often it isn't.
It's more of a piece of persuasion that needs to happen. So some of the other things that we ask for sometimes, Shaun, are completely different things. It's not always just one conversation. We're talking about all the times that we might negotiate for ourselves. What kind of things do you think come up for people that they would like to be better at being able to do?
Well, I think the guiding principle really first is decide, are you persuading or negotiating? And again, our guidance is that you persuade first and then negotiate later if you have to. So just listen to the conversation around asking for a pay rise. If I think of a different scenario, if I come to Tony and say, I want you to fund my MBA course that's going to cost £15,000 and I want 2 days a month study leave. Mm-hmm. By the way, Tony, can we do that?
Carry on.
Is that just a list of demands? And as Tony said, is there value on both sides? So if I don't explain, or at least try and build value for what Tony gets from it, what the company gets from it, then that probably won't be a very successful persuasion. If he's interested in that, if I've managed to persuade him because he sees value in it, then we may get round to negotiating how that gets applied.
Yeah, that's true. I think it comes back to the principle of negotiation. There has to be enough issues to negotiate with. If it's a single issue, it's not a negotiation. So if we took that scenario, Shaun's view would be, I can bring these things to the organisation once I've done an MBA. My view might be, well, okay, let's have a look what's included in that MBA and see whether it's valuable for the business. And then there'll be a fallback in there somewhere that would say, well, okay, we will do that, but if you leave the business within 3 years, you've got to pay the 15 grand back, because that then puts some risk on both sides, and that's quite usual in a negotiation.
Yeah, and I think if I approach you and we're just negotiating around single issues, then we probably get to deadlock quite quickly.
Yeah. I mean, that's the most important thing. You've got to have enough issues to negotiate and recognise that each of those issues will have a different value to each side of the negotiation. What value Shaun would get out of it is going to be different value to what the business is going to get out of it. But you have to recognise that, and that's the same with everything. It's the same when we look at persuasion. Shaun mentioned the difference between, or you ought to persuade first and then negotiate. But there is a persuasion going on in all the aspects of a negotiation as well, because we're saying that if we say persuasion is about building value for something, each value will be different in the eyes of the beholder, not necessarily in the eyes of the person that's trying to persuade. So let me give an example. We are taught in Western society, in schools usually, to persuade people with a weight of argument by putting forward as many different reasons as we can why something will be important to the other side. The danger of that is, if one of those things is not important, then the argument can fall apart. Right? I'll give you a quick example, a very short example. I like using examples of children because they're some of the best negotiators in the world.
Oh yeah.
My daughter was 5 years old and we were going away. In the back of a car, she wanted to put her Pushbike, and I said no, and she said why, and I said because we're going away to a holiday cottage and your friends will be there. We want you to play with them. They haven't got a Pushbike. She says, well, I want to take it. Well, you can't take it. Why? Because I think it's going to rain and you won't be able to go outside. Well, I want to take it. Well, you can't take it. Well, just because I say you can't take it. Okay, but I still want to take it. Well, why can't you take it? Because we can't get it in the car. So I walked into the house. When I came back, she'd crammed the Pushbike in the back of the car. Guess what? Because it went. Because basically there's one piece of that argument that fell apart. As soon as I said that you won't go in the car, and she proved it can, everything else fell apart. So that diluting your argument is something that we're taught to do when we're taught to persuade people certainly in Western society. So we're not taught to trade very much. We're taught to just try to force our position onto somebody.
So if we want to be able to trade, and then there's these different perceptions of value on each side, that sounds like there's a certain piece of work to be done, just like there is in a corporate negotiation, on thinking on what are all the issues that are going to be on the table for me or for the other person. And those issues don't have equal importance. So do you think that in personal negotiations we put the same importance and use of levers as we would in a business scenario?
Well, we may not give enough time in preparing for that. And I think, again, if we go back to this example of what is a fairly straightforward request to fund an MBA, that even within that there are negotiable issues. As Tony mentioned, it could be that one thing we do negotiate, if we see mutual benefit in doing that in the first place, is that if you do leave within a certain time after completing it, then you pay back a certain amount of the fee. We can negotiate about the amount of days that I'm allowed to have off for study time. We can even negotiate about the amount of funds that I pay up front. If it's £15,000, I might decide that that's my best. That's what I want the company to pay for. But actually, I'm willing to have some skin in the game, and I'm willing to fund some of that myself. So that becomes a negotiable issue as well. And it's thinking about where those trades are before you go into that that discussion. And as Tony mentioned, is not overloading with reason after reason after reason, because that it's a trap.
What's fascinating is the number of our clients that come to us who are interested in negotiation and what makes good negotiators is they'll say, well, when we negotiate, we can't really negotiate on many things because it's just price. And actually taking people through, okay, take price separately, the cost of a unit or a cost of one item, take that aside. What else can you negotiate on? And then when you start actually thinking about delivery costs and payment terms and branding and tangible and intangible items, all of a sudden, when they think I can only negotiate on one thing, all of a sudden you've got 5 or 6 or 10 negotiable issues that is either of value to us or value to the other party. And therefore, you've got a better chance to trade something rather than Tony just saying no, or conceding, okay, I'll try again next year. You've actually got sort of other things that you can leverage.
And do you think that so when it is our job, when it's our work and we are preparing for it, we're going to put the planning and prep time in because there might be millions at stake, even if we were just talking about price. When it's for us, I wonder if, the people I meet and talk to, we don't do it the same way it's for us. The maximum amount of prep we do for something that I want to negotiate personally barely even makes it to paper. It's probably just the forethought that goes in between the entrance and the desk of the dealership.
I think you're right, Benjamin. I mean, take the example of what most expensive item that anybody buys is usually a house. And within a house, they might actually decide some of the things they want, right? But I don't really think they ever go deciding how they're going to negotiate the price on that house. They go often with a view that all I've got to do, I've got this mortgage, this is what I can pay, this is all I've got. That's a single issue. And often people wouldn't think about, well, how am I going to bring the price down on that house? And in fact, is it a negotiation? Because if there's a lot of people queuing up to buy that house, the chances are it's just a straightforward, well, who's going to give me the most money? But people don't do the preparation, and you actually mentioned 2 words there, preparation and planning. They don't do that preparation and planning before, and I think it's quite important that we understand the difference between the 2 words. Preparation is about collecting facts and figures, and planning is about how you are going to use those facts and figures. And in all the research that Huthwaite did, what it found was that the amount of time that was spent on preparation and planning between average negotiators and skilled negotiators was the same. The difference was that skilled people spent more time thinking about how they were going to use the numbers, not what were the numbers. So it's quite an important difference between the 2.
And see, that's really interesting in itself, because I think that we don't necessarily, and stop me if I'm wrong, we don't start to perceive where the other party's coming from and how we will use the details that we've got. So when we bought our place, our house, we were very sort of specific in that we didn't have much flexibility on the overall price, but we could go for it right away. Yes. And we hunted for specifically things that were all like student places, because a ruling had very recently changed when we bought ours, and in the city we were in, they were building a whole heap of new student accommodation, so everyone was getting out of being an ex-student landlord. So almost the market set up the conditions to let us have more power in that situation. So sometimes just looking at what the market is doing can help you.
Okay, and so can what you did was recognise how much power you'd got, and that's extremely important. If you take a sale and buying relationship, if you talk to sellers about who's most powerful, they'll say the buyer is. Interestingly, when we talk to buyers or people in procurement, they'll tell us they think the seller's got more power because they have to buy a solution. So it's very important to kind of work out what the power is, but also how you are going to use it. Have you got enough power to force things through, or does it have to be a much more mutually acceptable conversation, really?
So, Joe, Tony brought in this idea of planning and prep, and we're talking about how it's for personal situations. We might not always have the same time that we'd apply to it at work. What would be the number one things that you would involve in your planning and prep before any kind of negotiation you were having, be it at home or at work or anything for you?
I would start to think about what I want, but also not make it too fixed. If I say I want, if you're buying a car or a house or something of value, or even I'm thinking of a new television, how much is the product that that you're prepared to spend, and where are my limits? How far can I go up or how far can I go down? And start to play around with that. So think about other things that would impact on that, whether it be delivery or if you're buying a house, like you were just saying, are the other things that have a monetary value that it isn't necessarily, like surveys or stamp duty? What are the other elements that have a price that can be taken elsewhere or be, depending on who you're buying from? So really thinking about where are all the costs going to be and kind of planning for how you can potentially get an agreement within those two limits, so your higher and lower limit. But I think using some kind of tool or writing it down, being able to plan ahead of time, or rather, if we, as Tony correctly said, prepare for how you want that negotiation to think before you go into it, but also thinking of what will the other party want, because that way you won't have as many surprises. You've given it due course to think, how far can I take what I want, but where are they willing to be? So again, we've got that agreement that both parties will want.
So there's this level of what both parties want. And you talked when you spoke about it earlier that it's about mutual agreement. It's about common ground. It's about working towards something that feels like there's been movement on both sides. So when I'm teaching people about this for work, there's almost every time, well, no, there is every single time, someone who makes some kind of joke or comment about using this at home with family, with partners, with children, and there's almost an undercurrent of disbelief of like. I guess my question is preparing and planning and thinking through the issues to the level that we do, is that appropriate with partners, with family at home, or is that a little bit manipulative?
No, I think there's certainly some, again, guiding principles you can apply to any situation where persuasion is required. If we talk about persuasion in isolation from negotiation, first of all is thinking, as Tony mentioned, is what's the power situation here? Have I got it, or does the other party have it? So that's the first thing to consider, because that will influence the type of behaviours that will work. Negotiating with or persuading a child to get dressed for school in the morning is a very different persuasion from asking a key decision maker to make a massive business decision.
I should hope so.
It's still often
I wouldn't try the same approach.
No, but you still often hear people making what we'd call a conditional proposal. So if you'll do this, then you can have that.
Yeah,
that's a classic with children,
yeah.
And children are extremely good at using it the other way around. So we've mentioned a few times about levers. Levers as in something that you'd use in physics as opposed to leaving a room. So we mentioned a few times about that. And if you think about kids, and for us, as a lever is something that you're prepared to give in order to get more back for it. And there's a classic one of that, which is the children who are crying or screaming, and they stop screaming as soon as you give them something and what they want. So if you think about that, the child screaming is quite prepared to scream and scream and scream and scream. Makes no difference to them. But if they give up, they'll get what they want. So they're quite prepared to be silent, in other words, give you silence, because it's easy for them to get back their ice cream or their whatever else it is. So it's something that's been prepared to give in order to get something which might be worth more value. So whilst it's a very simple example, that can be applied into everything from kids getting ice creams through to multinational negotiations. And it's quite important in those negotiations that the other side doesn't necessarily know how little the other party values that particular issue, and in that way you can get more and more back for things.
So the other thing that you are prepared to give is something that actually might cost you nothing to give. Yeah,
absolutely. If you think about maybe somebody selling water outside the Colosseum in Rome in the middle of August, if they put onto their stall only 4 bottles of water and they've got 300 in the fridge underneath, but they don't show those 300, they're quite happy to let you have that bottle of water. And because you're thirsty, you're probably going to pay a lot more money for it. And as soon as you've gone, they can go and get another bottle of water out and put it on and make sure that looks like it's a scarce thing as well. But actually, they're just quite happy for you to have it.
So that's interesting, because that's about controlling the conditions around it. And again, it's a business example. But when this is for ourselves, can we, Joe, control those situations around what we want if at work and things? I'm thinking about, I was hearing your MBA example, and I find ways to wangle my way onto the projects at work that take my fancy, things like podcast hosting and things like that. So that's been a steady process of partly dropping hints that I'm willing, but partly dropping hints that I might have a chance of being competent, and that might suit the business. Can we engineer scenarios like that, or do we risk looking devious and underhand and Machiavellian?
Wow. I suppose it does depend on the intention. If you're persistent with it and you're, asking the same person the same time for the same thing, then I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. But I wouldn't see it as negotiation. I think it's just the right time, right place for yourself in your example. I do think that whether it's personal or in business, the more knowledge we can think of about what it is that we want to get from that. And one of the things that we actually have, we don't necessarily see it as a negotiation, but it comes up a lot in everyday work environments, is working on projects. Oh, Benjamin, can you come and join me on this project? I really need your help and support. I need you to come to me. Well, if we leave it at that, that's not negotiation. That's me persuading you to join my team. If you were to retaliate and come back and say, well, Joe, I would love to, I think it's a great example, but what I would need is some support on my other things so that I can free myself up, or I need extended deadlines, etc. What you're then saying, even informally, is I need to trade. If I can give you what you're looking for, but I need something back in return. And recognizing that in those circumstances, you're just not always conceding. You're not always giving too much of yourself. Especially in a period of mindfulness and people being well-being and stuff, I think we sometimes do go, yes, okay, I'll help, and not really think, well, what's that going to do for me? So even just thinking, well, okay, I'd love to help, I'd love to be part of the team, but for me to do that, I'll need X. And you can decide what that is, and you can even give yourself time outside of it to think about what that alternative trade might be, but know that there's always an opportunity to trade something.
As we've said a few times, that we want to be trading, not conceding, and in business that's about us making sure that we're holding our own value and showing that we use the phrase sometimes nothing tell me the phrase, something given away for free has little value. Yeah. So we would say that. So I guess if we're saying that about ourselves, we're communicating that actually our time, our energy, our
Absolutely.
worth has some value in the situation.
Yeah, and it could be that the other party goes, oh, really? I'm sorry, I didn't realise that was, that was a situation, we'll go back. Or it can be, absolutely, we'll give you more resource. We'll put somebody else on a different project to free you up. But it's just knowing what is tradable and what should you walk away from or say no to.
So that's excellent. Do we have one last thing then from each of us when we are negotiating for ourselves that we should be bearing in mind? Shaun?
I think one of the key principles that I apply both in work and outside of work, when certainly trying to persuade, is not to focus heavily on me creating and building in my own mind a very logical argument, because that is my logic. And as a friend of mine who refused for years to come camping with us. We have a group of friends, and he refused to join in, and it was a constant source of frustration for most of us, because we wanted him to join in and be with the group. And I used to apply that thinking around logical arguments. So I'd say things like, well, in the evening we can sit around the fire and we'll drink red wine. And his response was, well, I can drink red wine at home.
Oh, I drink beer.
I'll drink beer at home. So whatever logical argument I had to try and persuade him to come camping with us, he had a retort, a logical response to that. And in time we relied on pure manipulation. we asked his daughter to scream and scream and scream until he gave in.
So another decision maker.
Yeah, but I guess the principle is when you're trying to persuade them, whether that's in the act of persuasion or during a negotiation, is not to rely on your logical reasoning, because you may fall into the trap of diluting your argument, as Tony mentioned earlier, or just come up against a brick wall because they have a different logic and they see things differently.
So Shaun says don't rely on logic. What do you say, Joe?
I agree. But also another sort of takeaway from me would be keep all of the issues, all of the items in the air. Don't agree on something as a final thing and then move on to another topic, because that really limits where you can take that conversation. So keep everything almost hypothetical. If you do this, we could do that. But keep all of those items up so that when you actually get to near the end of the negotiation, whether it's personal or business, you can then make sure that everybody's agreeing to the same things, and you still give yourself that flexibility to vary items depending on how that conversation goes. So, keep all the balls up in the air, I'd probably say, is my takeaway.
And Tony?
Joe's just said what I was going to say.
Oh.
Okay.
So I'll just
Sorry.
say, no, it's absolutely fine, and say something else. And for me, it is the most important thing, which is always keep referring back to your plan, even if that plan's only in your head. So I'm not suggesting that every time you get into a conversation and negotiation, you have to go away and write something down. But if you have realised it's a negotiation and you have got an objective in mind, but as Joe said earlier, you might want to be flexible with that objective. Just make sure that you're not being pushed in one direction, and just because there's a role going on, that you end up agreeing to things. So just keep reverting back, and if you need to, just spend a little bit more time and go away and think about it. And you can do that in most individual circumstances. You're buying a car, buying a house, whatever it is. You've got time to just step back a bit, just go away and think about it. Don't get caught up with the well, we've agreed this, we've agreed that, which you will see people using in dirty tricks. There are classics in dirty tricks in negotiation around they almost kind of, well, we've agreed this, we've agreed that, that's okay, that's fine, so therefore there's no reason why we can't do a deal then. And there is, and that may be that they haven't met one of your major criteria and you want to go away and think about it.
I think when you said about having at least your objective in your head, the way we ask people to form objectives on the program, where we say, you say what it is you want and what that's going to let you do. I want this so that I can do this. I've found that personally, if I've got in my head exactly what I want and what I want it for, when people are coming in with those additional asks and that little bit of pressure, I can relatively quickly evaluate, well, yeah, it does give me this, but that it will leave me in a position where I can no longer do the thing that I was doing it for. So I can, in the moment or really quickly assess whether this is a good deal.
Absolutely.